Hello and welcome to Commodity Culture, where we break down the commodity space for both new and experienced investors. My name is Jesse Day, and before we dive in, standard disclaimer: nothing here is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's episode is brought to you by moneymetals.com, the most trusted online bullion dealer and depository in the United States. Use Money Metals for purchasing, selling, or storing physical gold and silver. Hit the link in the description below to learn more and use coupon code JESSEDAY to get a $10 discount on your first purchase. Today's guest is an expert in the energy space with an impressive track record that includes growing Cadence Resources from 1 million to 400 million market cap in 5 years, founding a company that acquired the second largest silver mine in the world, and more. He is currently the CEO of LGX Energy. Howard Crosby, welcome to the show.
Jesse, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here. I'm very excited to discuss the oil space and fossil fuels in particular because that's a passion of mine, and I don't get to talk to enough people about it. But before we go there, let's start with the origin story, as you are a first-time guest. How did you first discover investing in energy and commodities, and how did that road lead you to where you are today?
Well, Jesse, it's been a long road, but I started out in life with a bachelor's degree in history and no idea what I was going to do. I ended up getting a job working for a company called United Nuclear in the uranium business, and I got exposed to the energy business in a big way in the early days of my career. Moved on from there. I started investing in oil as a direct participant in oil wells way back in the 80s, and I had some success. And my whole career really has revolved around managing and developing and founding projects related to different types of natural resource investments in both oil and gas and mining. But we had a lot of success in the early part of the new century with the oil business. I actually got interviewed twice on the CBS Evening News by Anthony Mason back in the early part of 2003, 2004. And happened to hit the prognostication right on the button in terms of what was about to happen with the oil price. So I follow the oil market very closely for a long time. It always is full of surprises. I certainly never thought that we would see oil go to negative $30 a barrel like we saw a couple of years back. That was a once in a lifetime opportunity to make a pile of money. But I think we're at a really interesting inflection point right now. We're seeing a lot of structural imbalances in supply and demand, both in terms of production, exploration and development, and even in terms of refining capacity worldwide. So it's a good place to be right now. This is why my partner and I started LGX Energy in November of 2021, just 2 years ago.
Well, let's continue along that trend then, because I know you believe that oil is the unbeatable commodity of the 21st century. And I want to separate fact from media narrative because we're seeing all sorts of news come out about the new green economy. Obviously, a lot of the political class is pushing that and claiming that we're going to be weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels, and soon humanity will be on 100% green energy. So is the reality different from the narrative out there in the media?
Well, yeah, I mean, Jesse, the reality is vastly different. Even countries that went down the green energy path fast and furious 15 years ago, for instance, Germany, which is near you, they're now encountering the problems with trying to rely on unreliable, non-firm sources of power. And so, just talking in terms of the energy picture alone, the future for fossil fuels, oil and gas, and coal even as well, is secure for the next century at least. But you have to remember that petroleum is involved in far more than transportation fuel or energy fuels. There's over 6,000 products that we rely on every day that are derived from petroleum, including probably the clothes that I'm wearing. Some of them are petroleum based. The computer that I'm talking to you on is petroleum based. My cell phone has petroleum based particles. If I had hair like you do and had to comb it, my comb would probably have been made from petroleum based products, and on and on and on. There's over 6,000 products that we use in everyday life that are derived from petroleum. We cannot have modern society as we know it without petroleum input. period, full stop. But even more important, in my mind, and I'm going to give you a little story here. I hope you don't mind a diversion, but in 1900, in the United States, 94% of our workforce was engaged in the occupation of subsistence farming. In other words, it took 94% of our workforce working to produce enough food to feed our people. Today, less than 2% of the American workforce works in agriculture as a farmer. Those less than 2% of the farmers produce orders of magnitude larger output of food products than the 94% did 125 years ago. Why is that possible? One reason: fossil fuels, which is diesel fuel to run the tractors and the combines and the machinery that makes a modern farm work. But even more important than that, the only way we can hope to feed the 8 billion people on planet Earth in 2023 is by the use of natural gas-based fertilizer. If we take away natural gas-based fertilizer, this planet starves. Full stop. We cannot provide enough fertilizer from potash or horse manure to feed the world. We've got to have nitrogen-derived natural gas-based fertilizers, or lots of us are going to starve.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you listed off many of the products that use petroleum in them, I put together one of the starts of this channel was doing documentaries, and I did a documentary on oil. And when it came to doing research of just how many things contain petroleum, it blew my mind. Very, very essential.
Staggering.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I'm wondering if you can, you kind of busted a few myths there, but maybe you could bust a few more when it comes to both fossil fuels and green energy solutions. What are people misunderstanding, and set the record straight for us?
Okay, well, let's talk. Let me diverge into electric vehicles, because that's becomes sort of an exciting development for the green energy components of our population. And quite frankly, nobody's in favor of needless pollution. But first of all, you have to understand that the amount of pollution that's created when you build an electric car is very significant. First of all, mining the raw materials. I don't think very many Tesla owners, for instance, understand that by owning an electric vehicle, they're supporting child labor in the Congo, because these vehicles require cobalt as an input to the battery. All the world's cobalt comes from either the Congo or Russia. We produce zero here in the United States and zero pretty much in North America. So we're importing all the cobalt that's coming from bad places that are doing bad things. Now, another interesting thing to think about is the batteries in your electric car, Jesse, are exactly the same as the gas tank in my car. If I don't put gasoline in that tank, that car is going nowhere. If you don't charge those batteries with electricity that was generated somewhere else, it's not going anywhere. Now, an important difference. When I dispose of my car at the end of life and it goes to the junkyard and they melt down the gas tank, there's nothing particularly toxic about that metal. However, when your Tesla needs to have those batteries replaced, disposing of those lithium-ion batteries with toxic metals in them is a big problem ecologically. Now, the other thing to consider, and I don't know how it is necessarily in Europe where you are, but I know in this country, and I'll mention that my late brother-in-law, who was the former Assistant Secretary of Energy for the United States, he was a brilliant guy. He basically pointed out to me that in about 80% of the states in the country, if you're driving an electric car and your electricity was generated by burning coal or oil or natural gas or a carbon fuel, you're actually less carbon neutral than you would be driving an efficient Toyota or Honda that gets 35 or 40 miles to the gallon. You're actually putting out less carbon than was created with that electric vehicle's electricity generation, not to mention all the carbon that was output in mining the materials to build the battery in the first place. So, I mean, it's all based on false premise across the board.
And what about hybrid vehicles? Are they less problematic than EVs in that sense? Is that a potential middle road that can meet the people who have this green energy utopia in their mind with a more practical approach? Or are there issues there as well?
Well, I think there's less issues for sure because in the end, you're relying on gasoline to power the vehicle. The electric portion of the hybrid, can be useful at times in terms of saving fuel, and and there's a much smaller amount of batteries in a hybrid than there are in an EV. I mean, electric vehicles on average weigh 2,000 pounds more than, which is, they weigh an extra ton over a gasoline powered vehicle because of the weight of the batteries. You don't have that issue so much in a hybrid. So, yeah, you still have the issues with the electric vehicle portion of the batteries, but you don't have nearly as many of them. So it's a lot less. And it is a way of saving fuel. And so I think hybrids may have a place. I'm not opposed to hybrids. And in fact, I don't care if somebody wants to virtue signal and drive a Tesla. I'm okay with it. Just understand what they're doing. They're not saving the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to stay on the new green economy topic for a moment because, I mentioned the political elite that have kind of been pushing this agenda for quite some time now, the mission to eliminate carbon emissions. Now, the amount of raw materials needed to accomplish this goal in the time frame they've laid out seems completely impossible. Do you think the whole movement towards the new green economy as it's being laid out is destined to fail in the end?
The two words that you just said could not have been more true, Jesse. Completely impossible. It is impossible for the world to provide enough of the critical raw materials to make the transition the way that it's been outlined by our political elites. Can't be done. There's not going to be enough cobalt. There's not going to be enough. There certainly isn't going to be enough copper. I mean, even Goldman Sachs is forecasting the copper price to rise to $15,000 a metric ton by next year or the year after. And, I know an awful lot about the history and the development of large deposits of copper around the world, the time it takes, the difficulty of discovering them, the fact that the largest copper mine in the world was discovered over 30 years ago and we haven't found anything that big since. We could go on and on this topic for an hour, but the fact of the matter is, number one, the raw materials won't be there, certainly not at any kind of price that anybody could ever live with. And secondly, the whole idea that they're going to that this is going to somehow change the dynamic of the world's weather is a whole other topic, And from my mind, I mean, I'm not a scientist per se, but I've done a lot of research and work in scientific discovery over my lifetime because of my interests and my business. And look, the fact of the matter is that one of the things that made me highly skeptical way back in the beginning of the so-called global warming hypothesis was when they all started talking about it. This is settled science. Do you remember that phrase? Well, this is settled science. We all agree it's settled. Well, no reputable scientist would ever claim that any part of science is settled. The very scientific method demands collecting data and applying observation to new data as it arises. Period. I can absolutely assure you with confidence that Isaac Newton would not have claimed that his theory of gravity was settled science. He would have said that it appears to be a theory that has merit, and that unless somebody can come up with data that shows differently by observation, then I'm confident that my theory is correct. However, I would revise it based on new data.
Does this change the bull thesis in a way for commodities like copper, like lithium and other battery metals? We're being told that there's a bullish scenario emerging due to the fact that all of these critical minerals are needed to bring about the EV revolution, to electrify the world. if that ultimately is going to get stopped in its tracks, does that kind of revise some of the numbers when it comes to the demand for a mineral like copper, for example?
Well, I think that I mean the bottom line is, copper historically grows, copper demand grows with population growth and whatever. But um, I think the way to look at that is the the green fantasy is destined to carry on for a while. It's not going to become obvious that the objectives are impossible over the next few years. There's going to be political movements to continue to drive toward this utopian fantasy, which in fact is not utopian at all, as we probably have discussed, Jesse. But the movement's going to continue. So I think the price forecast for copper and other battery-oriented metals like nickel and cobalt and so forth is probably destined to continue to be bullish. We've already seen a downtick in the lithium market because of the collapsing electric vehicle sales by major manufacturers in the United States. Ford took a $4 billion loss in 2023 on their EV division, and other manufacturers are experiencing something similar. So, other than Tesla, the wave of people buying electric vehicles seems to be not so much of a wave as a disinterested snicker. I mean, they're not selling. That's the bottom line. And they're transitioning away from building as many electric vehicles and as they did last year because they don't sell.
Well, let's shift to discussing the oil market and natural gas market specifically here. I'd like to get your take on the current supply demand fundamentals for both oil and natural gas. Obviously, a lot of recent geopolitical events, a kind of bifurcation of the world and the potential energy supplies in the world. Although, some of these events are not the funnest, they do seem to be bullish for oil and natural gas. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I would agree, Jesse. I certainly hope that what's going on in the Middle East doesn't break out into a much wider war, which would have a drastic impact on the oil price. I mean, if you got the Straits of Hormuz shut down, for instance, estimates are oil could hit $200 a barrel. Um, and, to the extent that the war widens in any way, it probably puts some upward pressure on oil prices and in general. Um, Even without that, I think, there's continued growth in demand for oil based products around the world, particularly as places like India, for instance, which doesn't get talked about near as much as China. But the population of India is set to pass the population of China at some point in this century. India continues very robust growth, where Chinese population growth has flattened and begun to level off and decline. So, uh, any growth of economic well-being in India puts tremendous pressure on world demand for petroleum products. And India is only one place. There's other parts in the Southeast Asia and other parts of the world that population growth is going to continue to push for greater demand. Living here in Southern California, I still see an awful lot of gasoline burning vehicles on our clogged freeways. So I don't see a lot of precipitous oil demand for transportation coming in the coming decades. And I certainly don't see any decline in demand for other petroleum based products of the 6,000 or so that we referred to. Now, in terms of natural gas, um, obviously there's a tremendous difference in the quoted price for natural gas that you pay in Europe versus what's currently available here in the United States. And it's vastly different, again, in Japan or places in Asia because of where the gas is, the difficulty of transporting it. You have to liquefy it and put it in a ship to take it across the ocean. So the thing that I think people may miss, because right now the natural gas price in the United States is relatively modest. If you look at Henry Hub quotes, for instance. What people tend to forget, though, with natural gas, Jesse, is that the decline curves on natural gas wells are much, much steeper than oil wells. So, for instance, some of these, like in the Bossier trend in southeast Texas, some of these wells that IP'd 3 years ago at 20 million cubic feet a day, by now are doing less than a million cubic feet a day. So they've declined by 95% in 3 years. In fact, they typically decline 75 or 80% in the first year. So as a gas producer, if you're not continually developing new wells to replace the flush production that just went by in a flash, it's hard to maintain stable production. Now, the one thing that's happened that will come to an end here fairly soon, when we had the last gas boom in this country, major oil and gas companies took up a lot of expensive leases in places like the Powder River Basin or the Bossier Trend in South Texas, and they had drill them or lose them provisions in those leases. So there has been drilling going on by a lot of the major companies even during the downturn in gas prices, so they could hold their leases by production. But as that has played out now, and as a lot of decline has hit some of the bigger fields, I think we're going to start to see upward pressure on natural gas prices in this country.
So you are known as the oil price oracle with a track record of calling oil price movements for decades. So what are your thoughts on the oil price as it currently stands? Are we headed to $100 a barrel anytime soon? I've heard some forecast by the end of year from certain analysts. Obviously, just assuming that the conflict in the Middle East doesn't expand, what are your thoughts on the oil price up ahead?
I would say short of an expansion of the conflict in the Middle East, I would doubt it if we hit $100 oil in the remainder of 2023. But I think the prices will remain fairly firm in the mid 80s to maybe the low 90s, just on speculation that the war could widen. I don't see much risk of any serious downside to the price because, when it got down to $60 a barrel and the administration promised they were going to refill all the oil that they pumped out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to force the price down prior to the last off-year election in the U.S. Turns out they didn't do that, and they're taking a lot of heat for not doing it now with oil back nearing 90. So, no, I really don't see much possibility of a serious downward trend in the near term. I would expect for the next few months, absent a breakout in the Middle East, we'd see oil prices more or less where they are in a range.
And you've also worked in the uranium sector. We love uranium on this show, so I'd love to get your current thoughts on the uranium market. We've seen a run up in the equities. We're seeing a run up in the spot price of uranium, now reaching, I think, the 15 years. It hasn't been at this current price level. Some people say the long-term price is more important, but I'd like to get your thoughts on the uranium sector here.
Uranium is such an interesting commodity because, so much of it is tied up in long-term contracts with utilities. And then the spot market is kind of indicative only of where the price is. I know I was looking at this a couple of years ago thinking when uranium prices were languishing around $48, $49 a pound, I thought a price movement was pretty imminent. And I was wrong. It continued to dribble along. But there have been, a lot of new reactors built in other parts of the world. Our reactors in this country, because we still have to have them online, the firm power, so they're all being life extended way beyond what was originally projected. And what's interesting is at the moment, we're not producing a single pound of uranium in the United States. And when the sanctions were put on Russia at the beginning of the Ukrainian war, uranium was very quietly eliminated from the list of embargo products because we have to have Russian uranium right now. Otherwise, our electric utilities can't fuel their reactors. So I think long term, with new capacity coming online, with the fact that in some parts of the world, they have actually recognized that nuclear power, uranium-based nuclear power, is actually the only carbon-free source of firm power. although I would argue that hydroelectric dams are pretty damn firm, absent a tremendous drought. They usually tend to spit out carbon-free power pretty reliably. But not everybody has a place to put a hydroelectric dam. And, when you look at the footprint of some of these solar and wind farms, and you compare that with the footprint of a nuclear power plant, there's a giant solar farm not far from me on the California-Nevada border. As you drive from Los Angeles toward Las Vegas, right on the state line, there's this huge solar farm. Takes dozens and dozens and probably well over 120, 150 acres of solar panels. And they're so reflective in that desert heat that every year they incinerate birds that fly over. A hawk or something flies over this and he bursts into flames.
Yeah, a lot of issues with,
which is interesting.
Yeah, with both wind and solar. I think I also wouldn't be surprised if that solar farm was largely funded with government subsidies, as a lot of these.
Almost undoubtedly, sure it was.
Yeah,
of course it is. Same thing with the windmills that we have down here in Palm Springs.
Right.
In the gap where the wind blows, they got a bunch of windmills. But I used to live up in Walla Walla County. If you've got a minute, I'll tell you this story.
Yeah.
So they had the largest wind farm in the country there, and it was owned by Florida Power and Light. Now, if you know anything about the map of the U.S., the state of Washington is in the opposite corner from Florida. So why did Florida invest $800 million in a wind farm in Washington state? Well, I was actually talking to the project manager after it was up and running. And, he was telling me all the problems with the wind farm. And I said, well, if you knew all this ahead of time, about these problems. Oh, yeah, we knew that. I said, well, why the big investment in the wind farm? Well, he said, with the money we invested in the wind project, we got enough green credits that we were able to build a 1,500 megawatt coal-fired power plant in Ocala, Florida. So they looked at the giant wind farm as just the sunk cost of the coal plant they needed.
That is incredible. A lot of hypocrisy going on in that whole green energy
I got another
movement.
one for you. This is in this week's news. This is a good one, if you haven't heard it. So there's Panasonic is building an electric vehicle battery plant in Kansas. I want to say near Topeka, but I'm not sure about that particular detail. But the federal government has given them a giant subsidy for this electric vehicle battery plant. I don't remember the exact number of the giant subsidy, but when I say giant, I mean a lot, right, of subsidy. Well, here's the problem. The Kansas utility company that provides electricity in that sector basically said, this plant is going to take so much power, we won't be able to provide it to you. So, in order to provide power to run Panasonic's new electric vehicle battery plant, the Kansas utility is having to restart a coal-fired power plant to provide the electricity for the EV battery plant. Now, isn't that just delicious?
I'm actually kind of bullish on coal a little bit.
Let's fire up some coal,
yeah,
so that we can build electric vehicle batteries.
Well, let me ask you about coal really quickly, because obviously we're seeing Germany burn a ton of coal in the face of the failure they've had with their supposed green energy transition. Pakistan taking a hard turn towards coal. China and India announcing massive build-outs to their coal capacity. What are your thoughts on coal here? Do you think we're going to see coal used for a long time to come? And could its use, it appears that it's going to actually expand coming up here.
It's hard to believe that it won't. Coal is an important source of energy. It's reliable. And with, to the extent that people in China and India would use the latest technology for scrubbers and things, a lot of the damage from it is the dirtiest fuel. There's no doubt about it. It's also a fuel that has helped civilization grow and prosper over the last 200 years. And it's created a much better quality of life for most people on Earth. So let's not make coal the enemy. To the extent we can clean up the use of coal, I'm all for it. It gets back to, if you think about it, Jesse, all the energy on this planet, with the possible exception of uranium ore, is solar power. It all comes from the sun, whether you're talking about wind power, solar power, natural gas, oil, and coal are basically solar power that's been concentrated under the heat and pressure of the Earth's crust for millions of years. So it's concentrated solar energy, but it came from the sun in the beginning, right? So, we're talking with fossil fuels, we're talking about concentrated solar energy. With solar and wind power or biofuels, where they burn switchgrass or even trees, you're talking about highly diluted, highly diffuse solar energy. That's basically the bottom line, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, but before I let you go, I do want to get your thoughts on the precious metals. You did found a company that acquired the second largest silver mine in the world. Maybe you could tell us about that and your current thoughts on gold and silver here.
Well, I suffer from being a perma bull on gold and silver. I buy them and I never sell them, and I never will, because gold is money. It has no other function. People ask me, "What do you think of the gold price?" I said, "Well, that's like asking you, I mean, gold doesn't have any other function. It's money. It's like asking, what's the price of a yen, or what's the price of a euro? I mean, gold functions as money. It's the only money that isn't someone else's liability. It has no counterparty risk. Nobody can create it in excess amounts out of thin air. So for 5,000 years, it's been humanity's best form of money, and I suspect it always will be. So, like I say, I'm a perma bull on gold, but I do think we saw it touch $2,000 an ounce again this morning in U.S. dollar terms. I don't know what it's like in the local currency there, but I suspect it's doing okay. Um, so, and as far as silver goes, silver has fascinated me my entire life. Back when digital imaging came around for digital cameras in the late 90s and very early part of the new century, everybody predicted that with the loss of 50% of silver industrial demand as people moved away from photographic film into digital cameras, that silver use would collapse. In fact, there's been over hundreds of new uses for silver have been discovered in the last 10 to 15 years, and industrial silver demand is higher than it ever was back in the photographic film days. And so it's a fascinating, reliable, required industrial mineral. You can't work a cell phone without it. Got to have silver in there. And back when photographic film was out there, people were recycling a lot of that film, recovering the silver. But when you throw away your cell phone, they're probably not going to get that microscopic amount of silver out of there to recycle it. So I think silver's future is very bright as well, because it's both a poor man's monetary metal, and it's also a very important industrial mineral. But anybody who thinks that silver has the monetary cash, if you will, of gold is wrong. Gold is the ultimate monetary metal. Silver is a poor man's substitute as a monetary metal only.
Well, Howard, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a very enlightening conversation. Before I let you go, for those who want to learn more, could you tell us about LGX Energy?
Yes, of course. I'm CEO of a new oil and gas company that we started 2 years ago. Go to our website, lgxenergycorp.com. We'll tell you all about what we're doing in the Illinois Basin, in particular in the state of Indiana, which for my money is the very best place to invest in American oil right now. And there's lots of reasons why. And just go to our website, once again, lgxenergycorp.com. You can sign up for one of our webinars to learn more about us and the opportunities available. And I think I just leave it right there, Jesse, because that's a whole other hour's conversation. But I really appreciate you having me, and I hope you've enjoyed it half as much as I have.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put a link to the LGX Energy website in the description for people who want to check that out. And thanks once again, Howard, for coming on and sharing all your knowledge with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, this episode is sponsored by moneymetals.com. Use coupon code JesseDay to get $10 off your first purchase. Link is in the description below, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.